One of the things that you find anti-Semites fond of is posing the question of why are Jews so hated everywhere they've been? Which in their simple minds is kind of proof that there has to be something wrong with us. Because if everyone is saying something, it must be true, right? Well, in reality, anti-Semitism is not a mystery. It's not hard to explain, and no, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with Jews any more than a rape victim is to blame for being a tease. So what's going on? First of all, Jews were not hated everywhere they were. In fact, when there were communities in areas that were not occupied by Abrahamic religions, the Jews were not marked by the majority as an especially hated group. For example, before Muhammad, the relationship with the people of Arabia were harmonious. And the Jews never suffered any specific persecution in places like India or in non-Abrahamic Africa. See, anti-Semitism as we know it has really two main reasons. The first is the behavior of the human creature towards any minority, and the second is Christianity, which is really the main culprit and responsible for most anti-Semitism to this day. So let's break this down. First, there's human nature. Humans are a social creature, and by nature, as a matter of instinct, they divide themselves into groups. Family, tribe, city, ethnicity, religion, political side, football club, doesn't matter. The human creature is always compelled to be part of a group. And human psychology divides the world into the groups I belong to and everyone else, the them group. And that's why any minority in human history, regardless of the time or place, any minority knows a degree of persecution. Whether it's a smaller tribe or a different religion or a sexual orientation, it doesn't matter. If you belong to the smaller group, there's a good chance you'll be marked as a them. Now, for most groups on the planet, that is a relative condition. For example, I always found it fascinating that the Irish suffered such persecution in America as the Jews did and the black community. In the 19th century and early 20th century, it was not uncommon to see signs in front of American businesses saying, "No blacks, no Jews, no Irish." I always thought it was such a weird thing with the Irish because they are Europeans and they are Christians. So what exactly is the problem? Well, there are the normal excuses you hear, like people would say that it's a religious thing. The Irish were Catholics and most Christians in America were anti-Catholic. But I believe the most important reason is that they came in late to the party. By the time the Irish arrived at America, the American population was well established, with a lot of people living there for several generations. So the Irish, by default, were a minority, a them. And the minority is always viewed as a them that is competing over the resources needed by the many. Now, when it comes to Jews, that is true everywhere in the world. Because unlike other minority groups, who are just minorities relative to where they are, Jews are a minority everywhere. For example, there's an Indian minority in the UK and in America, and in those places they definitely felt their share of persecution and racism. But there are 1.4 billion Indians in the world. There are places where they are the majority. And we're talking vast places. A country so large, it is considered a subcontinent. Jews, on the other hand, are only 17 million in total, worldwide. Not even a single % of the world's population. Jews are always the minority. No matter where you put us in the world, we are the minority. We are always the them. The only place where we are a small majority these days is Israel. A country so small, it can fit 45 times into Egypt, 444 times into the US, and 772 times into Russia. So that's the first reason. Jews have a chance of being persecuted everywhere they are because everywhere they go, they are always a minority. And then we have Christianity, which is the bigger and more influential culprit. But the real roots are in Rome. See, when the Romans occupied Judea and turned it into a province, they started to view Jews as troublemakers and weird. For one thing, Jews had only one God, and that God was invisible. To the Romans' mentality, that in itself was enough to judge Jews as a sort of a deficient race. You have to remember that Romans were pretty racist, as were many people at the time. And they believed fully in their superiority over other people. They believed their culture is superior and that it was the reason the gods favored them and allowed them to rule so many others. And they looked down upon all of the people they conquered. So when they came across these people who not only had their invisible one god, but also kept rebelling and killing Roman soldiers, they saw it as proof of the Jews' inferiority. And that is something people need to understand. No other province rebelled as often or as aggressively as Judea. For the Romans, the Jews were unreasonable, savage, and brutal. And that is the root of what would in time be transformed into modern anti-Semitism. Because while the Romans hated Jews, they ended up finding themselves in a very weird situation where their new chosen god was a Jew, and one they executed, no less. They also had to blame Jews for the appearance of Christianity. See, the reason Christians were hated by the Romans so much is that a lot of them were Roman converts. Now, in Rome, and in the ancient world in general, changing your religion was considered an act of treason. The Romans truly believed that if Roman citizens abandoned the gods to become Christians, the gods would abandon Rome in return. And they saw it as a physical act of violence against Rome in the real world. And where did this weird one-god religion come from? From the Jews. Where else? So not only are the Jews rebelling all the time, not only are they rejecting the obviously superior Roman culture, trying to remove Roman rule off of them, which would be a disaster to Rome from their perspective, now they also poison Roman citizens with this new one-god religion that originated with them. And you probably can already see the beginning of the tropes that we know today. Those anti-Semitic tropes about Jews poisoning the wells or killing Christian children. The Jew as a villain, as someone who cannot be trusted. That starts with Rome. And then they do the unbelievable. They adopt Christianity. Now, you might think that would improve the treatment of Jews, but it didn't. In fact, it had the opposite result. See, the Romans now had a god who was Jewish, and they themselves executed. But they wanted to be the heads of that religion. They wanted the religion to be the religion of the empire. And they can't say that the empire killed the Son of God and now they represent him. Another scapegoat had to be found. And wouldn't you know it, they already had the perfect one ready for them. So the story was concocted. It wasn't the Romans who killed Jesus, even though he was executed by Roman officials using a Roman method. No, it was those evil Jews who influenced the Romans into doing that. And thus, the evil Jews trope became embedded into Christianity. And through that religion, it spread throughout Europe. Now remember, Jews are a true minority, so most Christians throughout their lives never even met a Jew. They only heard about them in religious context where they were depicted as the villain. And then that mutated into folk tales and conspiracy theories. And every time something bad happened, the Jew was like the substitute for the boogeyman. If a plague spread in an area and there was a Jewish community nearby, everybody knew who was the real culprit. In the Christian mind, in the European mind, the Jew is a symbol of betrayal and evilness. The ultimate them. That is why Jews to this day are always the stars of every conspiracy theory, no matter how ridiculous. If you go through far-right, pro-Palestinian and neo-Nazi forums and chat rooms, you'd see Jews are to blame for everything. From natural disasters, to the prevalence of porn in society, to any corrupted government around the world. It's all the Jews. The Jews are the Christian world's boogeymen. Even now that a lot of them have become secular or atheist, it remains. which is why they are so quick to believe any lie or exaggeration about Jews, like the new genocide blood libel. And to hear more about that, including a breakdown of why exactly it is blood libel, see this video of mine, and the link is in the description. But that's not all. Through Christianity, anti-Semitism has traveled to the east and into Islam. See, Muhammad was very much influenced by Jews and Christians that he had encountered and had dealings with. And he had a terrific relationship with the Jews in his area, until his movement gained power and made the other tribal leaders anxious, and war was inevitable. And Muhammad thought that he would be able to rely on the Jews with which he had such good relationship, but they thought he would lose. And to go against the majority, the seemingly stronger leaders who opposed Muhammad, seemed like suicide to them. So they bet on the wrong horse. Muhammad saw that as betrayal, and from that moment on, he started adopting the anti-Semitic tropes that came from Christianity. That's why some verses in the Quran are very positive towards Jews. In Surah Al-Baqarah, the second surah in the Quran that is considered to be the most important surah, the Quran recognizes Jews as a chosen people, saying, "O children of Israel, remember my favor that I have bestowed upon you, and that I preferred you over the people of the world." And there are other verses that show respect towards Jews and acceptance of Jewish religion as true and valid. In fact, in the same surah, it says that Jews and Christians will be saved in the end of days. And then there are verses in which Jews are accused of betraying the covenant with God and betraying the Prophet Muhammad. And this difference in tone comes from the time in which those phrases were uttered, before or after Muhammad felt betrayed by the Jewish tribes. It was the Christian ideas of Jews as villains that Muhammad adopted in his anger. And these ideas have been used to incite hatred for the Jews in the Arab and Muslim world to this day. And that is why, throughout history, when a villain was needed, it was found in the Jews. That is why the Russians did it as well. They inherited anti-Semitism from Christianity, and when the communists needed the people to have a tangible enemy to rise up against, the Jews became the symbol of capitalists. And Zionism, which is Jewish self-determination, became the ultimate symbol of nationalism, which the communists claimed they are against. So why are Jews hated in Europe and the Muslim world? Because they are a true minority, a minority no matter where you place them, and because since the Roman times and through the influence of Christianity, they have been depicted as the ultimate villain, the ultimate scapegoat. And that same anti-Semitism is what drives these days the media to lie and incite against Israel specifically and Jews in general. It drives the anti-Semites at the UN. It drives the anti-Semitism we see in weekly hate marches supported by the police, even in countries in which they are clearly in violation of the law, like in the UK where I live. It drives the hate and thuggery against Jews in campuses in the West, in the disguise of fighting the man. Because in Western culture, the man is always the Jew. And that is why this tiny, tiny minority, only 0.2% of the world, and their tiny, tiny, tiny ancestral homeland is being so prominent in Western media. There is no other conflict, no other global issue where you would find people who have nothing to do with it. They are not Jews, they are not Palestinians, people who really have no horse in the race, and yet they dedicate so much time, sometimes their entire career, to talking about it and inciting people against the evil, evil Jews. Because it is embedded into the culture and has been for over 2,000 years. And exposing it and forcing it out of the culture is the only way to really fighting it.